somebody who is stupid enough to tackle the problems nobody can really tackle, like democracy, politics, and philosophy. Okay, all three of them are trouble. Bringing them all together
it's more simple.
It's impossible. Right, impossible. That's why Alain Badiou, who is coming to us now for few summers, many summers, and it's always a great delight to have you. Please welcome Alain Badiou.
We can begin by a striking contradiction. On one side, philosophy is clearly and by necessity a democratic activity. I shall explain why in a few minutes. On the other side, the political conceptions of the majority of philosophers, from Plato to myself, including Hegel, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, or Deleuze, are not at all democratic in the usual sense of the word. I shall also explain this point. So, we have a contradiction between the true nature of philosophy, which is certainly the democratic conception of discussion and thinking, and the explicit conceptions of philosophy in the political field, which very often accept an authoritarian framework for the collective destiny of human beings. We have something like a paradoxical relation between the three terms: democracy, politics, philosophy. We have first to go from democracy to philosophy. That was in fact the way of creation of philosophy by the ancient Greeks. The birth of philosophy is clearly dependent of the invention by the Greeks of the first form of a democratic power. But we have also to go from philosophy to politics. In fact, politics has certainly always been a major concern of the philosophers, all along the historical becoming of philosophy. But while politics is a reflexive object for philosophy, it is generally very difficult to go from that sort of politics to democracy. If you want, democracy is a necessity before philosophy and a difficulty after philosophy. Our question is, what is changed in politics by the philosophical action, so that democracy is first of all a necessity, and second of all, something impossible or very difficult. And our answer will be, the difficulty lies in the relation between the democratic notion of freedom and the philosophical concept of truth. In one word, if something like a political truth exists, that truth is an obligation for every rational mind. So freedom is absolutely limited. Conversely, if there is no such limitation, there is no political truth. But in that case, there is no positive relationship between philosophy and politics. So the three terms, politics, democracy, and philosophy, are finally tied by the question of truth. The obscure knot is in fact determined by the proper obscurity of the category of truth. So the problem is, what is a democratic concept of truth? What is, against relativism and skepticism, a democratic universality? What is a political rule which applies to all of us, but without the constraint of a transcendency? But let us begin by the beginning, by the two following points. First, why is democracy a condition for the existence of philosophy? And two, why is philosophy so often inappropriate to a democratic vision of politics? Philosophy has two fundamental characteristics. On the one hand, it is a discourse which is not dependent on the place of the man or the woman who speaks. If you prefer, philosophy is not the discourse of a king, of a priest, of a prophet, or of a god. There is no guarantee for the philosophical discourse on the side of transcendence, power, or sacred function. Philosophy assumes that the search for truth is open to everybody. The philosopher can be anybody. What he or she says is, if validated, not validated by his or her position, but only by its content. Or more technically, philosophical evaluation does not care about the subjective enunciation, but about the objective wording. Philosophy is a discourse without any other legitimacy than itself. But this is clearly a democratic characteristic. On the other hand, philosophy is directly exposed to the judgment of others. The philosophical discourse is made of anticipation of objections and acceptance of discussions. Its axiom is equality of all minds. And this equality is the permanent tribunal for philosophical discourse. And this is clearly a democratic tribunal. Philosophy by itself is completely indifferent to social, cultural, or religious position of who speaks or thinks. Philosophy accepts to be from everybody. And philosophy is exposed to approval or to critique without preliminary selection of who approves or objects. Philosophy accepts to be for everybody. We can therefore conclude that in its very essence, philosophy is democratic. But we must not forget that philosophy, which accepts to be completely universal in its origin as well as in its address, cannot accept to be democratic in the same sense in its goal, in its destination,